Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode of the podcast, we are discussing the animated science fantasy Nimona. And I want to give a quick shout out to listener S.M. Levine or Levine. I'm sorry, I wish I had thought about asking how you pronounce it. For the suggestion. Thank you so much for the great recommendation. If there is a movie that you would like us to discuss on the show, drop us a note on Instagram or YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, make sure you stick around for a little announcement, Kind of? At the end? A new tool, sort of?
Sort of? Anyway, here come the spoilers. In a medieval futuristic kingdom, the citizens are protected by the Institute for Elite Knights, established by the legendary heroine Glorith, who, 1,000 years ago, vanquished a great black monster. Ballister is about to become the first commoner to become a knight, as the queen is trying to change tradition so that anyone can be a hero. But during the ceremony, the queen is murdered and Ballister is framed. He's now being hunted by his fellow knights. Ballister goes into hiding and meets Nimona, a mysterious teenage shapeshifter who has faced persecution for her powers and dubs herself his new sidekick. To clear Ballister's name, the duo kidnaps the squire who gave him the murder weapon and discovered that the director of the knights is the murderer. Ballister and Nimona return to the Institute and trick the director into admitting to her actions, as she feared allowing commoners to become knights would lead to the kingdom's downfall. Ballister records her confession and posts it online, leading to public outcry. The director, recognizing Nimona's powers, discovers through ancient scrolls that Nimona is the great black monster that Glorith had defeated. She uses this to convince the public that Ballister used Nimona's powers to fake the confession. Shocked by the revelation, Ballister argues with Nimona and questions their friendship, feeling betrayed. Nimona flees into the woods and has a flashback in which she and Glorith were childhood best friends, even after Glorith discovered Nimona's powers. But when the rest of the village accused her of being a monster and attacked her, the village was accidentally set on fire. Instead of defending her friend, a confused Glorith turned on Nimona. Nimona breaks down and transforms into the black monster. This is back in the present. She attacks the city, intending to impale herself on the sword of Glorith's statue. Meanwhile, the director orders a laser cannon to be fired to kill Nimona, knowing that the laser will also kill innocent civilians. But Ballister stops Nimona and apologizes. She changes back to human form as they embrace and make amends. The director, unmoved, prepares to fire the cannon herself. To save the kingdom, Nimona assumes a giant red phoenix-like form and flies into the cannon, resulting in her death as well as the death of the director. Nimona and Ballister are honored as heroes, and when Ballister visits his old hideout, he hears Nimona's voice. Jenny, what did you think of this movie?
I can't say enough good things about this movie.
Yeah.
I've watched it twice now and can't really find anything about it that I don't like. In some ways, its messaging is very overt in the way that most animated movies are, but there are other aspects that are really subtle. The art is beautiful. Some scenes are just visually stunning. The world is this fabulous blend of something that feels almost historical and then these really lovely futuristic elements. Nimona is such a great character because she's simultaneously unpleasant in a lot of ways, but also very relatable and engaging. She's just, I feel like she's a lot in all the best ways.
Yes.
I think she's got some manic pixie dream girl kind of going on, but
sure.
she has so much more depth and really serves as a lot more than like just a lesson for the main character. So yeah, overall, I really just love this movie. I'm sure I will watch it again. What did you think?
Well, I thought the movie was adorable and made me cry. I loved it. The graphic novel has been on the top of my to-be-read pile for years. So if that's anything to go by, I was prepared to love this movie, especially because I haven't actually read the book yet, so I didn't know what to expect going in. Or at least the graphic novel. I also didn't read the webcomic, but anyway, I didn't know what to expect, except that I knew I would like it, and I did. It was so good. The whole analogy for being trans or not accepted for who you are inside, I thought, well, like Pretty Over, it was also really well thought out and emotional. Which, I mean, of course it is, considering N.D. Stevenson's experienced. I'm honestly a little bit obsessed with him and all of his work. Like, I think, Jenny, you introduced me to She-Ra, like, obsessed. Which does make it shocking that I haven't read Nimona, but that's my own burden. Anyway.
You're going to have to find it in your heart to forgive yourself for that.
I don't think I can. Anyway, I cried. I laughed a lot in this movie. I loved the animation, like you said. I loved the friendship. I do think it is a theme for Endy to really write life-changing friendships. And this was a wonderful one. You know, found family for the win.
Totally.
All right. So, anyway, what's something this movie does well that writers can use it in their own work?
So it really struck me in watching this that it has so many levels of conflict in it. And somehow we've never done an episode just about conflict. Like, how is that even possible?
That doesn't seem right. I'm
maybe
glad
it was like a
rectifying
secret.
that.
Yeah, maybe it was like a secret episode that we both did like in our sleep and it just never got uploaded.
That sounds right.
Totally.
It is one of those that we have touched on probably in every episode.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why we think we've done it.
So it's time. It's past time.
Past time.
Yeah. So this movie does conflict really well. There's a lot of conflict just inherent in the setup. So like the first quote unquote common person to become a knight in this civilization is of course going to ruffle some feathers. Change always does. So when we talk about conflict in storytelling, it always comes down to, like, in its most basic form, conflict is about opposing forces. So, like, those forces can be from a variety of sources, but it's always going to be two or more elements, whether they are people or monsters or forces of nature that are competing. And that competition, that conflict, is what pushes the story forward. It's one of the main elements of most forms of storytelling. So I do want to note that there are some that don't rely on conflict, but they have like their own set of rules, and they're all very specific things. So this is most forms of storytelling, as we normally talk about on here, most things that are kind of either based on or similar to 3-act structure.
Yep.
A conflict can so it comes about because the character has a goal and something is stopping them from accomplishing that goal. So this is really the heart of GMC, which we've discussed in a, I want to say recent, but definitely previous episode. Between 1 and 20 episodes ago, we discussed GMC. I think.
Between 1 and 40 episodes ago, I would say.
For those keeping track, this is episode 42. So I think Carly is probably right about that. But yeah, so when a character has an obstacle to overcome, they have to challenge themselves to make an attempt at overcoming it. And that space is where all the good stuff happens in a story. Now, there are several kinds of conflict, but they all fall under these two umbrellas. So external conflict and internal conflict. A successful story is going to have both, and they're going to have multiple kinds of conflict, multiple sources of conflict. And so these two main kinds of conflict drive not only the story, but also each other, which I think we're going to talk about more later. So yeah, that's the nutshell version of conflict.
I think that's a good nutshell.
Thanks.
All right, so let's break into external conflict. external conflict is basically the conflict we usually think of when we think of a story. It's the world acting upon your characters. It's the struggle between your characters and the world. So if you ask yourself, how does the world exert power over my characters? That's kind of external conflict. Now, when I say the world, that can mean a lot of things, because again, this is a bit of an umbrella. But basically, that is the antagonist, the plot, the antagonistic forces. So in this movie, it's mainly the director and her machinations, but it's also the society as a whole, and not the society not being able to accept Nimona for who Nimona is. It is the society set up around fighting monsters, quote unquote. It's the circumstances that have kept Ballister and Golden Loin from being together.
Can we just take a
Should
second
we
to
take a second?
appreciate? Can we just appreciate the last name Golden Loin?
Yeah,
Like,
it's great.
it is.
It's amazing, and I have
It
no
really
notes. No notes. It's great. So basically, you know, when you're like emotional and you're kind of thinking to yourself, can the world just give me a break for like a minute in your real life?
No, I have
no?
never felt that
You've
before.
never felt that?
Never.
Weird. That's external conflict. Not to poke at our own personal emotional wounds. External conflict is incredibly important when you're writing your book. It's the main thrust of the plot. If the world isn't acting upon your characters, if your characters aren't responding to the world, you can kind of be like, what is this book about? Obviously, there are exceptions to the rules. This one, at least in Western storytelling and like most storytelling, is kind of one of the things that doesn't have an exception. You can have a very internally conflict-driven story, but you'll still have the world reacting and responding to your characters. So you need it to move your story along. So if you think of your world and the antagonistic forces as a character in and of themselves, then you can kind of see how they interplay with your main characters throughout the story. So having a strong external conflict gives your story a forward momentum. And the more that pushes them externally, the faster paced your story will become, which is, of course, a double-edged sword. And have we done an episode on pacing? I don't know. I don't think so. We've done structure.
I always have to look at my list. I can't ever remember otherwise.
If not, we really should, because that would be good. Anyway, external conflict equals your plot, the end.
Okay, so if external conflict is about the world acting upon your character, internal conflict is about how the character's competing needs creates a sense of not always knowing the right or best thing to do. There's a lot that goes into this, like their general personality, their background, their goals. Actually, we covered a lot of this in the last episode about characterization, so definitely give that one a listen if you haven't already. But essentially, no person, no character is all one thing. So, for example, Nimona really wants to be accepted for who she is. She wants to be loved, but she is definitely not nice and often not even good. She has no love for the society, and yet she really doesn't want to see anyone get hurt. In other words, she's complex.
What?
I know, right? So when she comes up against conflict, she has to decide which part of her will take the lead. This is what all characters have to do. At its heart, this will be driven by their emotional wound and their lie. In other words, the ways they've learned to cope. Now, internal conflict is often synonymous with character arc, which is the way a character changes over the course of the story. So I want to add on to what Carly said, that while external conflict is definitely the main plot for genre fiction, when we get into contemporary, lit fic, and like general fiction, we often find that internal conflict is actually the main plot. The main difference here is that in a story where the external conflict is the main plot, like something external happens that forces the main character to act. While in a story where internal conflict is the main plot, the character makes a change first, and that change is what causes external things to happen.
Yeah.
So that's really the meaning of like character driven and plot driven, but nobody uses those terms right anyway, so I've given up. But you still have to have internal and external conflict, no matter what the quote unquote main plot of your story is.
Yeah. I think that's a better way to describe it than how I described it. So good job. All right. So now we're going to get into the interesting stuff, at least to me, and that's how internal and external conflict interact with each other. It's all about the push and pull between the two. So because that is where the most compelling stories thrive, you really want to nail that push and pull. So the external conflict is the world acting on your characters, and the internal conflict is the characters acting upon themselves, as we've said. The next step is figuring out how those two forces act upon each other. And that all kind of comes down to responses. Now, I think I've brought this cycle up before. I don't really remember when or if I did, but it always bears repeating. The way to kind of create a plot is by creating a cycle of emotional wounds, conflicts, actions, which are character decisions usually, then conflicts as a consequence of those actions, which are usually the world's decisions, etc. and etc. It's a fun cycle. And this cycle is basically an interplay between internal and external conflict. It is the world acting on your character, external conflict, that then throws the character into chaos because that external conflict has poked at their emotional wounds. Their response comes from that internal conflict, but their response itself often tends to be external. Their internal conflict has informed on how they interact with the external conflict. Right. So we see this in the movie very clearly through Nimona. Externally, the world sees her as a monster that is a danger. But internally, she's battling with her own self-perceptions and how the world has kind of beaten her down into believing that she is a monster. The internal and external conflict are inextricably tied. So without internal conflict, the external conflict has no meaning or power. And without external conflict, the internal conflict often can't really be overcome. Mm-hmm. You don't usually solve problems, even internal problems, by sitting in a vacuum and pondering them.
It's a shame because I'm pretty good at that.
I know, me too. But you usually have to seek help, or the world will push at those internal problems by poking at them and forcing you to work through them. You can't really have one without the other. Not completely, at least. And now I know I'm getting a little into psychology and therapy here, and I really don't mean to. But then again, what is a book if not about human experience? It's what connects your reader to your story, and you reflect that human experience through the internal and external conflict kind of push and pull.
Nice. And I do think that's one of the ways that we connect with stories is by, even if we haven't had that exact experience, having that connection to that universal human condition. Mm-hmm. We can always at least understand conflict and not knowing exactly what the right choice is. I think we've all been there. At least other people have. I always never exactly because I've never had external conflict. So
never.
One of the most interesting kinds of conflict a story can have, to me, is interpersonal. This is all about how characters interact with each other. And I just find it so much fun to dig into when I'm editing because it means taking each character's motivation and wounds and goals and seeing how they trigger those in other characters. Great. Yeah. So when characters are allies or friends, it usually means that their goals align, at least for the moment. But because the motivations behind those goals can be vastly different and the characters themselves have different personalities and backgrounds, they may not always agree on how to reach their shared goals. So to use an everyday example, living with your best friend can be super hard because while you may both want a safe and welcoming environment to come home to, you may have very different ideas about how to achieve and maintain that. So that kind of same concept can be applied to any two characters. Mm-hmm. What's really fun, I think, about interpersonal conflict is that it can happen with any two or more characters, from a main protagonist and a villain to two side characters who are mostly functioning in the background of the main scene. But yeah, interpersonal conflict really helps add depth to both internal and external conflict. It can be a part of the reason a character changes over the course of the story, or it can make them double down on their motivation. It's just such a rich area to explore.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, so I think that the best way to think about this is in every situation in a story, each character present is going to have their own thoughts about what's happening, their own needs, and their own motivations for being involved in that moment. So this is how we get villains and heroes who work together for a time, as well as allies who split because their ideas about how to meet their goal are just too different. So if you're struggling with this, or like struggling with a scene and how the characters are interacting, consider if each character were the main character of their own story. So like if you were seeing it from each character's perspective, how would each character act in that scene? How does that compare to the action of the story you're currently writing? So your characters may surprise you. There may be someone who might see it vastly differently from the way your main character, your POV character sees it. Just remember that this extends beyond arguing and dialogue. It has to be rooted in the character's psychology. And if the characters are going to work together, they have to find a way to compromise. Like, honestly, I love that the resolution to the main conflict between Nimona and Ballister is that he apologizes. Like, he sees the harm that he did and he attempts to make up for it, even though he doesn't know, like, all the backstory at that point. Like, he doesn't know that Nimona and Glorith used to be friends. He just knows her more recent history of, you know, feeling isolated and like no one really cares, and sees that he has triggered that. So yeah, interpersonal conflict, it's the best.
Yeah. It's
not
so
in real
good.
life, but it's fun to write.
I like how I think we've mentioned psychology the most in this episode.
I
so
think
far.
we have.
And I feel like that's pretty telling, because you would think it'd be like characterization, but really it's conflict, and I think that's kind of interesting.
It is. We should dig more into that.
Should we?
How does that make you feel?
I don't know, man. I'm tired. Makes me feel tired.
I don't get paid enough to be your therapist.
Ditto. But I was thinking, like you're talking about, he just apologizes, and I think that's really important. And it reminded me that the parts that made me cry the most in this movie was when he kept asking her to just be a girl because it was easier. And it made me so sad.
I know.
And I'm glad he apologized for that, because it was really rough. Anyway, okay. I'm digressing. So, moving on from that sadness and heartfelt horribleness. Okay, so one thing we haven't really gotten into much is the romantic conflict in this movie. Mostly because while the romance is compelling, the main thrust of this story is the friendship between Nimona and Ballister. As you can tell by the fact that we didn't even touch on Golden Loin in the synopsis. But to give you a quick overview, Ballister and Golden Loin, who does have a first name, but I prefer calling him Golden Loin, as Jenny and I have discussed.
It's
his
just
name
better. It's
is
an
better.
amazing name.
It's perfect. Ballister and Golden Loin are two knights in love. But when Ballister goes into hiding, they must contend with their belief in each other and who is lying to them. So now, to get into the romantic conflict. Most people think that romantic conflict comes from the will they, won't they thing. But mostly it really comes from the how will they. So honestly, internal and external conflict are never more on display than they are in romance novels.
Yeah.
Basically, romance novels are a masterclass in writing all into themselves, and I can't explain that, or I can't say that enough. But you can see it so clearly because the internal conflicts are very obvious in a romance, and the external conflict clearly interacts with the internal here.
Right.
So now let's go back to the how will they in a romance. That is a conflict and a question because each love interest has an internal reason for why they can't be together. So in this story, it's about the fear that they don't truly know each other. Goldenloin has to grapple with the idea that Ballister may have been lying to him their whole relationship. Ballister may have killed the queen, and if that is true, did Goldenloin even know him at all?
Yeah.
Was their whole relationship a lie too? And Ballister is grappling with the fact that Goldenloin doesn't believe him anymore. Maybe their relationship didn't mean as much to him as he thought it did. The external conflict is poking at their internal conflict. Their insecurities are on full display when the world, aka the director, frames Ballister for murder and forces them onto opposite sides in this fight. But it doesn't work if they aren't also questioning each other's loyalties and love. There's this romantic conflict there because we don't know how they will overcome their internalized fears in order to be together. And that is the basis of romantic conflict. How will they overcome their emotional wounds and find a way to be together when the world is constantly driving them apart? That is where the excitement in a romance comes from. Not the will they, but the how will they.
I love that. And I think that's also, too, like, for anybody who's like, I don't understand how people can keep reading a million romance novels. That's why. Because everyone is, yes, I know they're going to get together by the end because romance means a happily ever after. But how they get together, how they overcome their obstacles, that's what makes it interesting every time.
It's the journey, not the destination.
Yeah, or something like that.
Something like that.
Also the kissing. The kissing is part of it.
The kissing is great.
And there's also kissing in this movie.
There is. And it's also great.
It is. So the last part I want to talk about kind of goes off of what Carly was saying in terms of external conflict being the world acting upon your character, and it touches on some of the other things we've talked about too. I just want to go deeper on this to discuss it specifically in terms of the setting. So there are some obvious elements like weather or time of day that are going to create particular conflict for a character, but there are other ways the setting needs to impact the story, and these mostly relate to society. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a kind of main plot that is a character against society, where there may not necessarily even be like a bad guy TM. Mm-hmm. We recently talked about the Hunger Games, and I think it's a great example, especially when you look at the whole series. But in any story, regardless of whether it's our current world or set in another time or place, society will impact the character in big and small ways. So society dictates a lot of how a character can move within their world. So in this movie, we see this kind of dichotomy set up between Nimona and the human characters. She can really only function as long as she looks and acts human. Otherwise, she gets labeled as a monster and people get all pitchforky. For Ballister, he's able to move within the world much more normally. Even when people think he murdered the queen, he can basically like throw on a cloak and nobody knows who he is.
Yeah, can we talk about that? My husband was like, I feel like he would hide better if he just took off his armor.
He probably would.
Anyway.
But then we wouldn't know who he was.
Sure.
That is a very good point. How dare he find some flaw with this perfect movie, cinnamon roll of a movie. We must protect the baby. So it goes deeper than just the rules and who gets access to what resources. It also goes back to how a character feels about themselves because of how the society impacts them. So this is going to come down to religion, what society values, how the government is structured, all those kind of foundational elements of any group of people. So, like, the flashback alludes to the idea that Nimona is only kind of like this mean version of herself because she's been mistreated and isolated. And that gives her this sense of having to prove that she's worthy, even if that means being a villain. In a contemporary story that's more driven by a character's internal conflict, a big part of that conflict is going to come back to how society treats them or people like them. What are the implicit biases in that society about people like your main character? How does that character fight those biases? And how does that how does having to do that impact their overall idea about themselves? How does this messaging of their society impact what they think they can or can't do? So yeah, world building and setting can and should create a lot of conflict for your characters as well.
I think that's very well said.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so this movie has all the conflict, but next month we are watching the French classic Amélie. And also, we now have some fun things on YouTube. This pseudo announcement that Jenny alluded to. We have a bunch of playlists that pair up our top episodes for certain topics you may be working on. So, for example, we've got all of our episodes on story structure together in a nice, easy playlist. So if you want any other types of playlists, let us know and we will get on that.
Perfect. Yay, playlists.
Yay.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com. You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can follow us on Twitter, which I refuse to call anything else.
Yep.
And Instagram @StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.